pretty damn fun faction to play with. Not the most powerful faction, but in recent patches they have been buffed in some ways and they have become less powerful in some ways. The most notable way they have lost the power to make entire enemy armies chain route is through the nerfing of the fear effects from the Berserkers, from the fire arrows, whistling shot, and the curse on the hexbearers. With Suebi you have a few different options for generals. You have Voldemort Spears. Spears with a good charge bonus, able to tank it out in melee with their shield screen, and while they do have low armor, they have good melee defense, so they won't be hit very often in melee. Good shields that protects them against missiles, cavalry counter tactics. The Noble Riders, pretty decent melee cavalry, not the best, but they can work well against enemy cavalry, especially if you're able to support with some of your good spears. And the Swordmasters, your elite good sword unit, not on the level of Galatian Royal Guard and Oathsworn, but still a very good sword unit, able to deal massive damage to most infantry units in the game. Now for melee infantry you have these club units, and these include the Club Levy, the Bloodsworn and the Wolf Warriors. And you'll notice that they all have very low weapon damage, but they have pretty nice armor piercing, and they do have a bonus against infantry, which increases their melee attack and their weapon damage against infantry units. For your swords you have round shield swords and hexbearers. Round shield swords are decent sword units that are good against low to mid tier swords and spears, but aside from their decent charge, they're going to die pretty quickly. Use these guys in the rear and flanks of enemies, or up against inferior spear units. Then you have your hexbearers, and these gals are only 60 to a unit, so they will die very quickly. They have a good melee attack, they have low charge bonus, but they do have the curse effect, which is going to allow them to inflict a penalty to enemy morale. You also have your Berserkers, and these units are quite special in that they scare everyone, they can go berserk, and they have a chance to go berserk if they rush into melee and start getting killed, start taking some damage, and then they are going to be out of your control. So that can potentially be good because it makes them unbreakable, and they'll be able to get a lot of kills that way. With a good charge bonus, if you use Headhunt, Frenzy, and then they go berserk, these guys can get a monster amount of kills for their price. But if your enemy manages to catch them with cavalry and shoot at them with missiles, they're going to die very quickly indeed. Your Swordmasters, General's option, and also your elite sword units. For spears you have a nice selection from these pretty standard anti-cavalry spear units. Then you have the spear wall, and the spear wall is able to block up to 60% of incoming missiles with their shields. So that's a very useful unit to have in your front lines for the Suebi. In shield screen they can also stop enemy cavalry, and they are not the most effective units at stopping chariots frontally. Chariots will be able to pull through them. Spearwomen, hard to find a use for these gals. They have the frenzy charge and the cavalry counter tactics, but I think the spear wall is just a better unit for its price. 81 melee defense, that's going to make it very hard to hit in melee, especially when it uses its shield screen ability. The Night Hunters are a pretty special unit because they are expensive, they don't have armor, but they have frenzy charge and guerrilla deployment together with a scare effect, so this could potentially be used to deploy outside of your own deployment zone and to rear charge and get a decent amount of penalties to enemy morale, and that can rout units very quickly, but the problem is they are vulnerable, won't really stand up to missile fire, and they will die to good infantry units. Voldemort Spears, same as the General's unit. For your skirmishers you have crappy slings, crappy bows. You have decent skirmishers because these guys have a big chance to block incoming missiles. These Kimbri bowwomen are pretty special because they have a 30 bonus against cavalry with spears in melee, but still if they get charged while they are firing they're going to die very quickly. Good morale for their price and a decent amount of health, but you need to keep these gals out of missile fire and melee, and then they can do well for themselves. But if they run out of ammunition and you need to take care of enemy cavalry or you need to rear charge, they can actually do quite well in melee. Then you have the Horse Runners, and this is a kind of a hybrid unit that is pretty fast because it's light, it has a decent amount of armor, can throw its javelins, and then it can go into rear charge or support melee fights. Your cavalry department is fairly anemic in your Riders of the Hunt melee cavalry. That is decent against enemy cavalry, but by no means good. The same with the noble riders. They are decent, but they are not great against enemy cavalry. This is a pretty great unit, the Germanic Scout Riders, because they can use their javelins and then they can charge into melee and do some pretty nice damage if you rear charge with them. So for the Suebi, the bread and butter is of course going to be strong sword infantry, supported by decent spears. And if you're going to go pure rush Suebi, you might as well save on the skirmishers, but it's going to be pretty difficult, because if you go for 2 Berserkers is a nice amount, I think, because they can be unreliable. If you, for example, make them run amok or berserk, they don't have you won't have control over them anymore, and they might just run into enemy pikes, and they will be very easy to bait with cheap units and then destroy them with cavalry, so can be a bit dangerous. It's also nice to have Germanic Scout Riders to harass on the flanks and then go for rear charges when they're out of ammunition. If you want a more solid type of sword build, you can go for round shield swords, support them with some very cheap spears, and then you have some denarii left to spend on some more cavalry units, should you so wish. But something to be aware of with this Suebi is that, well, just another thing, they can be made to work as a fairly effective skirmishing force if you go for if you want to go for the mid-tier type of Suebi units. They can be quite effective when used this way if you're able to kite well, and if you're able to harass with scout riders and get all of your arrows off before you charge into melee and finish enemy units with the rear charges and so on. And a build that was pretty popular in previous patches when the scare effects were more pronounced, Suebi Fair build. So you're going to use you can use a noble rider general to make sure that he is where you need him to be. You're going to blob up a lot of your units, and units that are good against infantry, some spear units to protect against cavalry. You might even have some a few swordmasters and wolf warriors. But then you would use these hex bearers in the center of your Suebi blob. It could also be useful to have some more cavalry to strike out at skirmishers and such. And then you basically what you would do, would you bunch up your guys, then you would use Ariovistus' fast charge ability, get them into melee, activate Pride, and then your units are going to have massive charge bonuses. To make this even more effective, you could go for 2 Cimbri bow women, and you could use their flaming shot and their whistling shot to further reduce the morale of enemies, and this could make enemies chain rout extremely quickly, but it doesn't really work that well anymore. But still, the Ariovistus ability, if you can manage to time it right with the fast charge and the pride, it makes even the crappy Suebi units like the Club Levy and the Bloodthorn very, very dangerous on the charge, because the Bloodthorn have a 33 charge bonus, which is pretty decent, the Wolf Warriors 35, so you need to get these guys into, you need to get the charges off, and the Berserkers with their charge bonus of 51 together with fast charge and pride can be absolutely devastating, but they are easy to counter for a player that knows what he's doing. So the Suebi gives you a nice number of options of going either rush heavy or for a more skirmish type of build, or going for, if you want to go for a more balanced type of Suebi build, you can go for some elite swords, you can go for some round shield swords, you can go for some mid-tier spears, you can go for some Cimbri bowwomen for skirmishing support, some light scout riders for harassing, and then you can go for some riders of the hunt as well. So many things that Suebi can do. Suebi will do a bit better on maps that are not completely flat, maps that have some hills, some forests, to kind of reduce their susceptibility to missiles and make sure that you get into melee where you need to be. So that's it for the Suebi. Pretty fun faction to play with. Not the best faction, but it can handle a lot of things in this game. It will have problems against chariots. If enemy chariots are thundering towards your spear walls and they are in shield screen, make sure to support with missiles and cavalry as well, because they're not going to be able to take down the chariots alone. That's it for the Suebi. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again on the battlefield.